Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Mystic Chat. And today we welcome a very dear a friend of mine, Theo Geer, who sits on the board and is the president of the Fellowship of the Phoenix, the LGBTQ pagan church that I'm actually ordained with. And today we're going to talk about queer spirituality and share some opinions and stories and all those good things. So you already know who I am. Let's introduce Theo. Theo, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are and your path and things like that.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Theo. My pronouns are they, them. I'm currently the president of the National Organization for the Fellowship of Phoenix. We're a queer organization specifically trying to serve queer pagan communities to help everyone find the divine in their experience and in the world in which they live. We were actually started in 2004. Our first ritual was Samhain of 2004. And so we've been operating in Chicago for, I guess that makes it almost 16 years now, or 17 years. It's quite a while. I actually met Chris at the very first ritual back in November of 2004, and I'm really excited to be here today. My personal background is I come from an agnostic family, so I didn't grow up pagan or with any other religious denomination. And in my teens, when I started feeling the need for some sort of like spiritual path, paganism is what drew me. I always have had a very animist feel about my life. And so when the fellowship came into my life, and I realized that the gods, the divine, the spirits didn't need to just be stoic ideas of, centuries and centuries ago mythologies. I really warmed to that and warmed to the idea that our spirituality is a living organism that is part of our communities, that weaves its way through our lives back and forth in so many diverse ways, that I became really fascinated by that. And I've really worked with the fellowship for all these years to try and promote that sense of evolving spirituality. And a spirituality that's rooted in who we are and where we are as a people and as a community today. So yeah, that's who I am, where I'm at, and I'm happy to be here talking to you all today.
That's awesome. So one of the things that I see in like taglines all the time is the whole idea of queer spirituality, or you hear queer paganism, or queer witchcraft, or queer anything. What do you think that separates, say, I mean, obviously the LGBTQ, what distinguishes in your mind between queer spirituality and say mainstream spirituality? I have to unmute you, don't I? Okay, hold on. Let me do that. There you are. There we go. There you go.
Sorry about that. I'm really fast with the mute button, and I just forgot. I'm sorry. What did you ask, Chris?
So what separates queer spirituality from mainstream spirituality in your experience and research? What's the difference?
There's a lot of different ways to answer that question, and I really believe that it is very up to the person to find the answer for themselves. For myself, there's sort of two main parts to what separates queer spirituality from just spirituality or from mainstream religions. One is that in a lot of mainstream religion, whether it's mainstream paganism or Catholicism or any other religion that is just sort of out there and is not queer focused, is a religion to create community, to create binding sense of sense of welcomingness and fellowship, it tends to direct itself at the largest contingent demographics of that religious community. And since queer people are a minority in almost all of these traditions aren't built to serve queer people. They're not built to serve us, and they don't speak to us. They don't speak to our experiences or our revelations in the world. So queer spirituality, in contrast to that, is focused on the queer experience. It is focused on serving and meeting queer people where they are. So that's one of the things that I think is a strong differentiator. And the other one is a little more woobly, but for me, a core tenet of queer spirituality is the recognition that everyone in our communities, every queer person, every person that comes to a fellowship event, has their own unique experience in life. And queer spirituality seeks to recognize those unique experiences and embrace them all without trying to project, oh, this is what the gay experience is, this is what the lesbian experience is. Recognizing that we do have commonalities, that trying to find a commonality and say, this is what we all share, is not a game that anyone can win, and it only serves to divide us. So in queer spaces and queer communities, it's really important to me to recognize that our identities and our experiences are incredibly unique and diverse. And our job as an organization for queer spirituality and for queer people in general is to make sure that we are opening our arms and our hearts to all of those experiences and not trying to separate them or exclude them or put any gatekeeping on them.
I think it's interesting because, when I first was introduced to a queer spirituality, we didn't even call it queer spirituality. We just we call it spirituality that had a gay slant, which leads me to the next thing I want to talk about is the word queer itself. And, so personally, I never had a problem with the word. It was fine. I never felt like, oh, if you call me queer, it's a big deal. Like, for myself, it was okay. I know for others, it has some trauma associated with it. But as now, queer has become a powerful word. In fact, I think it's almost a badge of honor. And I think it's weird because, and I don't know, I go back and forth on this. And, I think there are certain times throughout the decades that it's cool to be queer, and then we lose fashion a little bit, or I don't say we lose fashion. It's almost like we become too, is going to sound strange, and we become too normalized in society. Then we have a resurgence with queer again, and so what is, in your experience, what does the word mean? What kind of power does it have for you?
That's a really good question. We've actually had a lot of conversations inside the fellowship, as you of course know, about what words to use. The fellowship started its life as the Brotherhood, as an organization for specifically gay men of all gender identities, as long as you identified as men. And as the years went on, the organization went through this process of transformation, which is wonderful because we're an organization dedicated to Phoenix. We're all about transformation. But we went through this transformation where we realized that gay, bisexual, and trans men wasn't all of our community. It was part of our community. And so we were doing that thing that I said earlier I didn't want queer spirituality to be about. We were saying, okay, this is the narrow subset of experiences we're trying to serve. And so when we sort of underwent that transformation process and became the fellowship and sort of opened our doors much wider, one of the big conversations was whether the word queer was appropriate, because you're right, there's a lot of people who have trauma around that word because it has been used as a slur for a lot of people. And there's a lot of reasons both to use it and not to use it. I sort of follow the principle of individuals should be identified how they choose to identify. You use their word. And when you are discussing a group, you try and use the word that is most inclusive of that group and most descriptive without being needlessly restrictive or trying to put a stamp on someone's experience. And so the result of that attempt to broaden the idea of spiritual community and the queer community has led us to LGBT and several Qs, IA plus, sometimes number 2. And there's no consensus among what that acronym should be or how long it can get. But the word queer doesn't have that problem.
Right. Well, that's true.
Queer is broad. It is beautiful. And for me personally, not talking about the fellowship, I consider myself queer because I'm not just, sexually queer. I'm queer in so many ways. I am neuroqueer. My neurology is different than other people. I think in different ways and I experience the world in different ways. I'm pansexual, so I am open to sexual and romantic encounters with people of all genders. I'm also non-binary, so I'm part of the trans community. So queer is all of those things. And I feel like a lot of times when we talk about, a person is a member of the queer community, we try and bucket them. Oh, are they the B? Are they the T? Are they the G? Which part are they? And that sort of creates this gap where people who are lesbian and trans fall through because they're more than one of these things.
Right.
And so for me, the word queer and that idea of queerness is about opening those doors wide and letting people come as they are and be who they are in their truest way.
That's awesome. We do have some questions, but before we get to the question, I kind of want to piggyback on that. What you just said. How do we blend spirituality with what you just said? Like, what does that look like? I know that's a big thing, but or how about this? How do we begin to look at it? How do we begin to open our hearts to that?
Yeah, this is another one where I'm going to start with the very core statement. I think everyone has to find their own path and their own way to spirituality. From my point of view, where I sit today, how do we start that? How do we find that way? How do we introduce queerness into spirituality? I feel like I'm saying this a lot, but it really comes back to opening things up. Queerness and queer spirituality is something that our more dominant cultures seek to repress. They're always pushing down because it's not part of the normative society. And so the first step is always questioning sort of the rules, the guidelines, the things that have been put in place to contain folks. And so a big one of that for me is, and obviously I'm pagan, are there many gods or one God? Or is it some combination thereof? Are the gods discrete entities, or are they part of some numinous vastness? I think simply asking questions like that, whether or not you have a good answer, a concrete answer, or any answer at all, I think starting those questions begins to crack that seed that lets spirituality blossom. I really think that our experiences lead us to the answer that works best for us.
So I'm trying to find it now because this chat.
Well, while you're looking at that, there's actually a question that popped up from John that I'd love to answer. So John asks, does the questioning process need to be for those of us who feel we don't fit in, or is this something everything ought to do? 100%, I think it's something everybody ought to do, or at least the vast majority of people. One of my personal rules is that there is nothing that is for absolutely everyone. There's always going to be someone or some group of people that a maxim or a dictate or an idea we come up with is not going to serve. And so I'm always shy of saying every single person needs to do this. But in general, yeah, asking questions about assumptions you've been given or things you were taught that may or may not seem perfectly rational is always a good idea. Oh, there's only one God? Well, why have so many people talked about many gods? It's a simple question, but when you engage with it, it can lead you to answers other than the one you were originally given.
Mm. So Camian actually asked a good question. He says, does queer spirituality include work with allies, even ritual space? What do you think?
I'd love to hear your answer on that, but I will give mine first.
No,
My answer is absolutely it does.
I
Um,
actually have uh, two answers to that. My first answer is yes, and it depends. So the yes is let's welcome all people if we can. Let's share space because in my view, the more people who are on your train, on your thought train, or on your spiritual train, then the more power you give it. However, I do think that there are some spaces that are meant for queer people, but I don't think it's every single time. I think it depends. Like for example, if someone is say you're doing I don't know a prayer or an energy healing, say for trauma that was brought on by hate crime. I think um for some people and you could have the biggest ally who's very supportive, but at that moment that person who we're praying with, if they're doing energy healing with, maybe they just need a queer space. But I think that's so not always the case because I love having my allies around. I love having people who want to like, you want to drum? Let's drum. I'm all about it. So what do you think, Theo?
um, I really agree with everything you've said there. Particularly, I want to focus in for just a brief moment on the need for queer space. There is, and I think for a long time will continue to be, a need for space for queer people to be together as queer people.
Mhm.
And, you know, a lot of people use the term safe space to discuss things like that. It's not really my favorite term, but I think it captures the general meaning. Um, what I'd like to add to that, and to add to what you're saying, and even to the question, is does queer spirituality include work with allies, even ritual space? Yes. And I would go further to say that it also includes work even in ritual space with people who aren't allies.
Hmm.
That's not to say that we should let people who are homophobic or transphobic or misogynist show up and try and disrupt our work, but I believe that spirituality and the ritual work can, in many ways, be enlightening and empowering, even for those who may not think they need it.
Hmm.
And while it seems unlikely to me in most cases, if someone is not queer or even thinks that queer people are terrible, but feels drawn to come to some sort of public event where queer people are celebrated and is not disruptive, then perhaps there's a reason they need to be there. And I don't feel the need to judge or restrict their ability to partake in most scenarios.
I think it's interesting because I think in that situation, and we could never truly know, but maybe they're questioning. Or maybe they're just saying, "Hey, I have all these feelings about it. I'm pissed off at gay people. Let me try to understand where that's we're coming from." And even that little thing is growth, I think. Um, I had a question, and I really enjoyed what we're talking about, and I lost it. It'll come back to me. But, but anyway, you know, so when it comes to like that, what you were just saying, um, I think that's how we educate people. That's I remember now. So when I was interning at the hospital for chaplaincy, um, there was this a person. I don't want to say she wasn't gay friendly or anything. I'll just say it wasn't in her energy and it wasn't in her mindset. Much less the whole pagan thing. And I'm very unapologetic. I'm like, I am a gay pagan. I have no qualms about it, but I'm gonna take ownership of that. That's me. When not everybody feels the need to do that, and that's okay. But for me, I was like, you know, I was not loud and proud about it. Isn't the space for that, but when it came to like talking about theology or talking about spirituality, I did talk about it. And all of a sudden I would have um, those chaplains say, "Oh, I never thought of that," or "Hey, I learned something today," or "Well, before you, what got here was never in my field of thought." And I was like, for those of us who feel empowered to do that, I think we should. um but I also think there's a way to do it that people will what's the word I'm looking for, uh sometimes if you uh adjust adjusting to their energy and adjusting to their thought process. For me, how I am is if someone starts screaming at me about anything, I'm just like, oh, shut down, shut down, shut down. So I try to remember that when I'm screaming or talking about gay spirituality, try to um, meet people where they're at. At least, that's my philosophy. Um, so I know that a lot of people who are going to hear this show on the podcast and watch it on YouTube may not um, have a whole lot of experience with gay spirituality. How does someone open? How do you think someone should um, create space for queer spirituality? So I guess if I'm trying to be an ally and I've never been an ally, how do I become an ally? What does that look like?
You know, uh, I've not really thought too much about that. I think it's something that, uh, again, I've said this a lot, but it really does come back to questioning. And I love that a moment ago you were talking about, when you have discussions with other chaplains in training and other folks, uh, one of your best experiences is when you say something and they look at you and they're like, huh, I never actually really considered that. And I love that approach because it really is, it's that crack in the wall. It's the willingness to hear and understand something outside your own experience. Um, and I love what you said about meeting people where they're at, because I really think that that is at the core of a lot of it. So if we're talking to someone who wants to be an ally to queer folk, who wants to engage with queer spirituality, either because they're queer or they're questioning, or they just want to like, what's going on here? I think sort of the place to start is always where you are. And I tell this to my students, I talk about this a lot. Like everything always has to start with where you are. Because if you imagine that, oh, I'm going to learn this thing, and oh, but I can't learn the thing until I get to this other place or until I know this thing. We put a lot of barriers in place to ourselves that way. And so just like it's helpful for you and me when we're talking to other people to meet them where they are, if you are choosing to go someplace, meet yourself where you are first. Figure
Hmm.
out where you are. What are my thoughts on queer people? What are my thoughts on this thing that I saw? Even if you don't know enough to have thoughts, write them down or ask yourself, what are my thoughts?
Yeah.
And then once you've done that, interrogate them, question those thoughts. Why do I think this? What am I perceiving that's giving me this idea? When it comes to creating like space for it, I want to say that creating space is as simple as asking a question, but as complex as being open to self-love. And
Mm.
that's like a big ask, right?
Mhm.
Because to have space for queer spirituality, you have to be willing, number one, willing to question the things that you think you know. And number two, willing to accept who you are at this moment so that you can grow into something different and change. And for me, one of the things that we haven't talked a lot about, but that I think is really central, and you actually talked about a little bit at the beginning, the definition of queer and who folks are is constantly changing. We go through these cycles of, queer people of one variety being kind of accepted in like the dominant culture, and then they're pushed to the side, and then maybe a different queer group is kind of accepted. But it's this constantly evolving and changing vision of who is queer and what we are and what the queer community is. And so I think recognition of queer spirituality is a recognition of life, of things
Mm.
living, growing, and changing as time moves on, and being willing to grow and change with them. And I think that's one of the challenges that paganism in particular has, particularly in the United States, is that we always seem to be looking for the way. This is the way to honor the
Yeah.
goddess. This is the way to
No.
cast a circle. This is the way to do all these things. Um, and I'm a little more comfortable with that when we say this is the way our ancestors did this specific thing. Like, I think that's a valid question to ask and something that like looking into brings a lot of value. But when we start talking about ourselves and try and like narrow that down to the specific, the way, the right thing, um, it's like putting ourselves in a little tiny bonsai box and saying we can grow to be this size and fill out these lines, and that's the limit.
Mm.
And I don't think that gives us the space to grow organically and to discover who we are.
Hmm. So I want to kind of switch gears a little bit because I'd like to stir the pot a little bit. So for a lot of people who consider themselves queer pagan or queer spiritual or queer trying to find the divine or whatever, there's a topic of sex and sexuality, and I think it's an important thing for to talk about because I can remember a few years ago, and I haven't seen it in a while, but there was this there was a meme going around, and there's two pictures. The first picture is the Stonewall riots, and it says this is what true pride is, and then the next is a prideful float with someone half naked dancing, and it said, "This is bullshit." To me, I wanted to reach through that screen and punch someone in the face because of one of the things, and I respect everyone's choice to be sexual and not be sexual, what that looks like for them and things like that. And I try to allow myself to be educated about different things and different concepts. But after all that, after 51 years of trauma, of abuse, of hate crimes, of of being hurt, of being some people being kicked out of their church and their home, I want to dance naked on a goddamn float, because, and I think that part of the problem is that in my opinion, I think some people forget that pride is also sexuality in whatever form it takes for people. Um, What's your take on sexuality and queer spirituality?
Oh, that's
I know.
well, first of all, I really resonate with your like feeling to that particular meme
Mhm.
because by all the gods, the people who rioted at Stonewall rioted for the right to dance naked in the street, among other things.
Yes.
Like one of the stripes on the traditional rainbow pride flag stands for sexuality. It is part of the queer experience, including asexuality,
Mm-hmm.
because it is queer. It is something that is apart from the normal. It is something that is often repressed and treated very poorly by our culture. So like before we go any further, yes, all of that is queer, and all varieties of sexuality. I'm also not going to go too far down this tangent, I promise. But it is the Pride season, which means it is also the season of does kink belong at Pride? And the answer is yes. Kinky people who are queer are also queer, and their sexuality and their experience of their sexuality, even when it involves power exchange and things that perhaps are not typical, is part of Pride and is part of queerness. And
Absolutely.
as to how that comes into queer spirituality, I'm getting a little excited, so please bear with me if I'm like yelling at you. I'm really not mad, I'm just
I love it.
vocal.
I love it. I love it.
Um, Unabashedly, yes. Sexuality is part of our experience as humans, or asexuality or demisexuality. All of these things are our experience, and however we experience the world is what we should bring to our spirituality. And I truly, in my heart of hearts, believe that the the worst thing that was ever done to our culture, to our philosophy, was the separation of our experience from our spirituality, of our body from our spirituality. Who
Mm-hmm.
we are and how we live is our spirituality. It has to all be together. And that's not saying that you can't be a person who says, oh, I like to do ritual in these clothes, in this corner of the room, on this day of the week. That's totally fine. You can also say, oh, I do ritual whenever the whim takes me and I just wear what I'm wearing. Or I do it in the shower because that's what makes me happy and I like water. Like all of these things are equally valid and acceptable, because they are all coming from us living our lives. And so when we ask about is sexuality part of queer spirituality, I don't know, is cooking part of queer spirituality? Of course it is. It's a thing you do. It is part of your life. You take it and you move forward. And any individual thing you do, if you do it with an open heart, if you do it with your mind towards the divine, with your being in tune with yourself and with the life you want to live, that's spirituality to me. And so I will argue up one side and down the other against anyone who tries to say that spirituality has to be some separate ascetic thing that is, what's the word I'm looking for? Sanitized and put on a shelf and carefully tended. Because that's not life, and that's definitely not the queer experience that I'm living.
Absolutely. And I don't think spirituality should be sanitized because especially being pagan for people of the earth, and the earth gets awfully dirty sometimes. I mean, that being said, I'd like to do a thing and take a bath. That's a whole different thing. I still want to get dirty. Um, you know, it's interesting because, and we talked about this in the fellowship, especially with me and stuff, because I think sexuality is a big component of gay spirituality, and especially in paganism. But for me, I don't feel comfortable in overtly sexual spaces. What I mean by that is to where, and no judgment in at all. It's just a personal preference. That there are some traditions to where they're very sexualized, and you go skyclad and things like that. And I can remember people telling me, "Oh, then you mustn't be ashamed of your body," which I hate that because you're putting on judgment and on someone's boundaries, you know. And I mean, because of COVID, I think I gained some weight, but other than that, I don't really have any hangups about my body. But I for me, it's just nothing I'm drawn to it. I'm not approved at all. But in your experience with different groups or philosophies, how do we maneuver? How do we navigate that? Because on one hand, I think a lot of people want to experiment and say, hey, what tradition do I belong in? On the other hand, I, for me, I'm trying to use my statements. For me, I think it's hard to say, hey, I want to be a guest at your ritual experiment. Okay, but you have to take off your clothes and do A, B, and C. That's hard for me. So how would you navigate all that?
Um, I think that just like with everything else involving sexuality and really everything else involving everything, it really is about consent. Whenever there's even one person doing something by themselves, like consent is involved. And if you think it's not, then maybe you need to go back to questioning yourself. Oop, I broke my rule. I made a hard limit, but I actually do really believe in that one. Um, Consent is at the heart of all choices and decisions we make. And the second there's more than one person involved, it becomes, as you said, a little tricky to navigate sometimes. You know, if there is a tradition that practices in the nude, um, for you in your experience, that's probably not going to be very comfortable, and you have to make the choice of whether or not you want to do that. I also think it's perfectly valid that people can practice in the nude without it being overtly sexual or sexualized. We in our culture really sexualize the naked figure, but that's our projection onto nudity. That is not necessarily an intrinsic property of nudity.
Say it out loud. Say it out loud. That was awesome. Thank you for that.
And so you might, through experimentation, find that you're comfortable with nudity as long as it's not sexualized. Or maybe you'll just, no, I'm not comfortable with nudity, period. And either of those is okay. Like, that's just how it is. But for those who are trying to like navigate that, my personal like rules are: one, ask first. Any tradition that will not tell you, oh yes, we practice nude, or no, we don't practice nude, if they're keeping that a secret, for me, that's a red flag. Like,
Yeah.
these are things that if you are asking questions respectfully, because you might want to participate, they should be very comfortable and open discussing those things. And I'm going to tangent a little bit here, because talking about consent and talking about like that openness has reminded me that there's a lot of like problems in the pagan community as well as in the queer community about not respecting boundaries, and about secrecy for secrecy's sake.
Yeah.
And so I want to like say, like, for the fellowship and for myself, when I'm talking about queer spirituality, I'm not talking about things hidden behind doors, because I don't believe queer people should be in closets. I don't believe that our traditions or practices should be something that we can't talk about or don't talk about. And so for me, it is a red flag if like I'm thinking about going to an event and I say, hey, what can I expect at this event? And the response like is, oh, we don't talk about that. You just have to show up and have faith. Like, no, trust is a two-way street. We have to share and have discourse. And I can't consent to something if we haven't talked about it.
You know, back in the day, and you know, there were several traditions and in orders that was a part of their initiation. For me personally, I didn't have a problem with that aspect of it, but I know people who did. And on one hand, someone said, yeah, because you know, some people have different level of a body confidence. On one hand, one person said, "Oh, I'm glad I worked through that fear because I actually found power in that." On the other hand, another person said that was bullshit and I'm fine being naked, but what was the point? You know? And in those two circumstances, there was never, it was interesting because because way back 20 years ago, it was understood that there was nudity in the initiation because it was in the books, but nobody really informed anybody. To be honest, I haven't been initiated into anything in a very, very, very long time because I've been doing this for so long. I don't know if people are still doing that, to be honest. I mean, if someone knows and wants to share in the chat, please do. But I wonder about that because, in the fellowship, we let them know there is no nudity at all. Don't worry about that, But I also know there's another group that is completely nude, but they tell you beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
And, and I am also a big proponent of, because I hate this, if I want to work on my fear, give that choice to me. I think it's okay to say, hey, I think it's a good idea if you work on your fears, and then stop talking. Don't say with sexuality or with this, because at that point it goes from, hi, you're a spiritual teacher, to ick, at least in my belief system.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I want to like really quick call back to what we were talking about. John asked in the chat, what about folks who aren't ready to be out? So I said that I don't believe that queer spirituality or queer folk belong in the closet. I mean that in a macro sense. So thank you for like calling that out, John. Obviously not obvious, since it wasn't obvious when I said it. What people choose to come out in their own time, in their own way, and some people never choose to come out, and that's also consensual and totally okay. There's like no reason people have to be out. And when it comes to like nudity, I guarantee you there are still people who do like very traditional nude initiations and nude rites. John pointed out that Richard signed yes. Thank you, Richard.
But do
It
they tell
happens.
you beforehand, though?
Some of
Or
them
they're
do, some of them
surprised?
don't, because it's about those mysteries. Personally, that's not for me. I don't want to be part of like forcing people to uncomfortable situations. That's actually something I really like about the fellowship and the rituals we do. As you were talking about, yeah, I want to work on my fear, but it's like my choice and my like steps to take. One of the things that we do, I think, a fairly good job of in the fellowship is creating ritual structures that create a container for people to do the work that they want to do without like projecting, like, this is exactly what you need to do. Like, we do a good job of making that crucible where, okay, now this is our spellcraft part of the ritual. What is the work you're going to be doing? What are you bringing to this ritual? What are you bringing to your path?
Yeah.
And making space for people. And I really love making space for people, as well as being cognizant of the fact that the crucible, the setup that works for one person or one group of people is not going to work for everyone. So being willing to create different types of spaces and different movements is, I think, really important in queer spirituality, because one template's not going to serve everyone.
Well, as you were saying all, as I was thinking, I'm 100% on board, because certain things bring up trauma, certain things bring up some bad memories, and I don't think it's okay to force someone to work on their trauma or work on their things unless they're in that place. And also, I'm one of those people, I will go deep in my trauma. I'll blood, sweat, and tears, but I wanted to do it alone. Like, if you say in this ritual, it's going to be hardcore, we're going to do this. If I can take that home and just my own expression, I'm happy. If you tell me, oh, you have to do it in front of 25 strangers, I'm gonna not, at least me, I'm not gonna go as deep, because I'm gonna be thinking about other things, which leads me into how much do you think that uh, queer spirituality in all its various forms is about working on your fears and your trauma and your things?
Um, I think it is the same amount as any other form of spirituality. And the reason I say it that way is I think that we have uh, almost a fetishistic obsession with the trauma of queer folks in our culture.
Mm,
In our media, you can't just have a person who is a character who just happens to be gay. They
mhm,
have to be a gay person who's had trauma and whose story arc revolves around their gay trauma.
mhm,
And I really want to avoid saying that queer spirituality should be centered around your queer trauma, because it's not.
mhm,
If you have trauma, whether it's queer or otherwise, yes, your spirituality is a place that you can work through it if you so choose.
mhm.
But it's really important to me that we not try and center that, because I think centering that plays really strongly into that fetishization and that further distancing and isolation of queer people and queer bodies and queer experiences. Um, so that said, obviously, yes, the point of spirituality, for me anyway, is about breaking myself open. It's about becoming more in touch with the center of myself and my relationship with everything around me, be that the gods, the spirits, the earth, my community. It's
Mhm,
all of those things and more. And so, yes, my trauma comes into that.
mhm.
My depression comes into that. My anxiety comes into that. And yes, I use my spirituality to help me work through those things. And sometimes it goes great and sometimes it does not.
Mhm.
And like you, Chris, sometimes I just want to be left alone.
Yep.
Yes, I know I'm depressed. I know I haven't gotten out of bed in 2 days for anything meaningful, but you know what? This is where I'm at, and it's better than I was 6 months ago. So that's where I'm going to be, and I'm cool with that. I'm going to work on it tomorrow if I can. I think those are things that we really have to like acknowledge, and at the same time acknowledge the joy of being queer. I love like, and I emphatically mean this. I love being queer. I love knowing that one, and this is petty of me, but I love knowing that my very existence and my happiness and joy in being queer pisses people fucking off. Like
Love it.
it makes me
Yes.
so mad.
Yes.
And
I
so
love
that
it.
petty part of me loves it. But I also love it because it brings me so much joy. I get to support my friends and my family and my community. I get to see things and people grow. And in my role in the fellowship, I get to see people take on responsibilities and try new things and come up with answers and solutions to problems that we've never faced before and see people grow. And I get to do that all knowing that these are people in my queer community that are all having that celebration of being different and bringing out the best part of themselves.
That's awesome and so beautiful. Thank you for saying that. You know, one of the things over my queer spiritual experience the last blah 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 years um, is I kind of relate in a good way. I relate to the queer experience, the queer expression, the queer spirituality as like trickster gods and trickster spirits. The reason is that the tricksters, like be it you know Hermes or Crow or whatever, uh, their purpose is to shake up the status quo for spiritual growth. Because what happens when everything's okay and everything's even keel, we are human. If we get settled in our bliss and we don't grow, we don't change as fast. And then the trickster comes and shakes everything up, and then I have to be better. I think queer in queer spirituality and just I think queerness in general, even without the spirituality, that's what we do. We shake up the status quo. We make things glittery. We tear things down, and at the same time, we show our rear ends on a float, because it's not about hurting people. It's not about causing trauma. It's about I am going to shake up the status quo because we need to grow. Have you had that experience or realizations or anything?
Oh my God, yes. So I'm not going to say that like it's a queer habit of getting with trickster deities,
I love
but
that word.
I do believe there's a reason why so many queer pagans are oathed or work with chthonic deities and trickster deities like a lot.
I know. I
And
know.
I do think that it is because queer people and the way that we interact with the dominant culture, we do become agents of change. And that's why I think that the Fellowship of the Phoenix and our traditions focusing on transformation change is so vitally important. Um, there's one of the things that I've been encountering a lot in recent years, and that I just want to bring up is sort of two turns of phrase. So one came from our Seattle temple. They started last year, or actually maybe the year before. But instead of saying queer spirituality, they coined this term queerituality. And I really like
I
that,
like
and
it.
it's near and dear to my heart because it's just a great way of thinking about things.
Spirituality.
Um,
Spirituality.
and something else that I think is really core is we were just talking about gods. And, I'm a pan polytheist. I believe that there are many gods from many different areas who wear many faces, and many of whom have several names. One of the things about the fellowship is we work with a set of deities we call the queer divine. And there's 8 or 7 or 9, depending on who you talk to, sometimes only 3 or 4, because it's about our own experience. And one of the conversations that's come up that I want to like put out here is, well, is it possible that like this divinity we're working with is really just so and so God wearing a different face or wearing a different name? Um, and I'm a pan polytheist. I believe that yes, that is entirely possible. But we're a queer tradition. We don't dead name the divine. If someone comes to me and says, I'm the explorer, they're the explorer. That's who they're presenting themselves as. That's who they say they are. It's not my job to try and figure out who they were in another setting. Um, so when we're talking about divinity and the gods, like I try and like remind myself of that very frequently, because it can be very tempting to do the syncretic thing and say, oh, well, the divine youth is another name for Ganymede.
Mhm.
And I think that that is a mistake many times, not
Yeah.
always. But the reason I think it's a mistake is when we start making those associations, one, unless that divinity came to me and said they were Ganymede, I'm projecting that upon them. I'm trying to give them a history that may or may not be theirs. And if we believe that divine entities are real separate entities, then that's just rude and not consensual. Um, but I also think it's a mistake because even if we take the more archetypal approach and believe that like these are symbols that exist in our collective unconscious, and so there's no consent issues with those naming conventions,
Mhm.
when we like start to commit to that association, we're drawing a box around them.
Mhm.
And my thoughts on drawing boxes around them. I talked about it a little bit before. I don't think that permits us to grow or to change. And I'm here for the change and the transformation. I
Yeah.
don't want to like put cages around things that don't need cages.
So as we close, if because like I said before, we're going to have a whole lot of viewers who aren't queer. What would you, if what would you like the world to know about queer spirituality? Like, if you can, I know this is going to be hard. If you can really bring it down to a few things, what would that be?
Oh boy. Okay. Number one, queerness is beautiful and joyful. It is not a trap. It is not a sin. It is not a failing. It is a way of being. um, Queer spirituality specifically is a way of opening our hearts to accepting queerness and all that it represents in our culture and community, and allowing ourselves to grow into who we are truly and into
Mm,
all of our relationships.
mm,
At its heart, something I don't think I've said so far on this call, so I'll say it. I think queer spirituality is about relationship with ourself, with the divine, with the spirits, and with our community.
mm,
And so if we were trying to find that, if you're not queer, if you're just learning about queer spirituality for the first time, the thing to take away is that it's not about your one queer cousin. It's not about any individual. It's about our communities, and it's about opening up and learning to embrace who we are as individuals and as a collective.
That was beautiful. Thank you for that. As we close, I am going to turn off all the recordings. I can say all now. And then we'll open it up for questions. So I want to thank you, everyone listening on podcasts and Facebook Live and YouTube video. Thank you so much for joining us. And we shall see you soon. I'm just going to stop the recording.